It all started in the 3rd grade, on a chilly autumn day when I first laid eyes on George. Even back then, he stood out. His small, pale frame and dishwater blonde hair contrasted sharply with his love for black vintage clothes, giving him an eerie appearance like a blend between a vampire and an undertaker. And if that wasn't odd enough, there was something stranger about him. George believed he could talk to crows. At recess, while the rest of the kids ran around in bursts of laughter and play, George would sit by himself, surrounded by a flock of crows, whispering as if they were old friends. His blue eyes, so pale they were almost white, never seemed to focus on anything other than the birds. Curious, I approached him. "What are you doing?" Talking to the crows," he said calmly, as if that was the most natural thing in the world. I frowned, folding my arms. "You can't talk to crows." George turned his head slightly, that faint smile of his never faltering. "Most people can't, but I can." I didn't believe him. Of course, who would? But something about his quiet confidence made me want to know more. How? He explained that crows were intelligent creatures, capable of complex communication. They had their own language, jokes, even names for each other. George claimed he could understand them, and more shockingly, that they could understand him. Skeptical, I pointed to one of the birds nearby. "What's that one saying?" He gestured toward a particularly grumpy-looking crow. "That's Percival, he's mad, because Diana stole the caterpillar he was eyeing." I stared at George, half expecting him to burst into laughter and admit it was all a joke. But he didn't. Instead, he pointed to another bird. "That's Enoch. He's an elder. He's watching you, trying to figure out if you're a friend or foe." I turned to look at Enoch. Sure enough, the bird was eyeing me with an unsettling intensity. It was the first time I'd ever seen an animal, especially a crow, exude such human-like curiosity. I sat down next to George, still unsure if he was just messing with me or if he really believed all this. "I'm Maria," I said, offering a tentative smile. That's how our friendship began. Two misfits in a small town, one talking to crows, and the other, well, fascinated by him. As the years passed, I realized George wasn't just some quirky kid with a strange imagination. He genuinely had a connection with these birds. He knew each crow by name and could predict their behavior with an eerie precision. He would bring them snacks, peanuts, eggs, shiny things, and they would bring him gifts in return, like coins or bottle caps. The crows adored him, and in return, he loved them back. When Enoch died, George and I held a small funeral in the backyard where George sobbed openly as the crows circled overhead, almost as if they were mourning too. By this time, I was living with my grandparents, while my parents dealt with a messy divorce. In this small, mostly white town, I felt like an outsider, a half-Mexican girl, in a place that saw me as foreign. But George, with his odd ways, and his crows made me feel like I belonged somewhere. We were both outcasts, but together, we found solace in each other's company. One evening, George was over for dinner, and my grandmother noticed a few crows pecking at the window, trying to get his attention. She shot him a nervous look. "Why are they doing that?" Without missing a beat, George replied, "Crows remember human faces. They know who their friends are." My grandfather, always the joker, chuckled. "What about the people who aren't nice to them?" George's expression darkened slightly. "They remember those people too, and they tell the others. Crows don't forgive easily." It was one of those moments where my grandpa's laughter faded quickly, replaced by a quiet unease. George wasn't joking. I had no doubt the crows had their own little system of justice. Eventually, they started following me too. At first, it was just a few, trailing me whenever I left the house. I mentioned it to George one day, and his face lit up with that rare, wide grin of his. "They know you're my friend," he said proudly. "You're a part of the murder now." At first, it was unsettling. I didn't exactly love the idea of being followed by a murder of crows, but over time, I grew used to it. After all, George trusted them, and I trusted George. We grew older, but nothing really changed between us. George remained my closest friend, and the crows? Well, they were always there, a silent, watchful presence in the background of our lives. Looking back, George's relationship with the crows wasn't just about talking to them. It was about finding connection, where most people couldn't. In a world that often felt cold and distant, George found warmth in the black-feathered creatures that others overlooked. And somehow, through our bond, I found that same warmth too. It was strange, surreal even, but to George, It was simply the way things were, and to me it became the most real thing. In an otherwise hazy, restless life, there's one event that stands out vividly in my mind, one that happened before everything fell apart. It was right after I got my driver's license and inherited my grandma's old blue sedan. I was driving into town when I saw George. It wasn't unusual to see him walking along the local roads, but this time was different. He wasn't walking. He was standing along the highway in that thin strip of grass between the forest and the asphalt, staring intently at the ground. Something felt off. I pulled over, got out of the car, and walked over to him. "George, you okay?" I asked. Without looking up, he muttered, "Hi, Maria. You're just in time for the feast." Confused, I followed his gaze and immediately wished I hadn't. A deer lay in the grass, its side torn open, intestines spilling out onto the dirt, blood pooled around it, and the crows were there, pecking at its exposed flesh, pulling bits of muscle and tissue, some drinking the congealing blood. The worst part, the deer was still alive. It gasped for breath, its chest heaving weakly, its wide, glassy eyes blinking in helpless agony. It was being eaten alive. I froze, horrified, feeling helpless but unable to look away. My heart pounded, and the urge to put the creature out of its misery welled up in me, but I didn't know how. I was terrified. Then I noticed George was holding something. In his hands was a baby crow, all white, its feathers pure as snow, an oddity in a sea of black. He was feeding the tiny bird a piece of the deer's flesh, staining the crow's pink beak with blood. "This is Lux," he said calmly, like he wasn't standing in the middle of a nightmare. The others rejected her, because she looks different. I'm taking care of her, though. One day, I'll introduce her to the murder. Numb, I nodded, my mind spinning. I backed away, got into my car, and drove off, trying to push the image of that poor deer out of my head. Crows are scavengers, I told myself. It was just nature, the circle of life. But even then, I knew deep down that something about the scene was wrong. Still, that incident seemed like nothing compared to what came after. The real trouble started when George began dating Kate. They met at some upscale event, the type of thing only rich people get invited to, and they hit it off. I was probably the only one who found it unsettling that a 22-year-old woman was dating a high schooler. Everyone brushed it off with comments, like, "He'll be 18 soon anyway." Kate was from the Oxford family, old New England money, with ties that went back to the Mayflower. The Oxfords were practically royalty in our small town, owning half the businesses and carrying an air of entitlement wherever they went. Kate wasn't mean exactly, but she was bossy and shallow, with a life of privilege that insulated her from the realities of the world. I couldn't understand what George saw in her, but he was infatuated. She was the first girl to show him any real attention, and he was head over heels. Everyone talked about how lucky he was. "Kate's a catch," they'd say. "She'll straighten him out. They'll have a fairy tale wedding." By the end of the summer, I wasn't surprised when I received their wedding invitation. The wedding itself was a spectacle, like something straight out of a bridal magazine. Kate's Pinterest-perfect vision come to life, with delicate flowers, fine china, and her gown like something from a dream. Despite the beautiful weather, she insisted on an indoor ceremony. "Those stupid birds won't leave us alone." I overheard her complaining to a bridesmaid. I wasn't sure why I went, but I did out of loyalty to George. I didn't enjoy myself. Kate made it pretty clear that she didn't want me there, but George seemed happy, and that was enough for me. After the wedding, everything changed. George stopped coming around as often. Every time I tried to see him, he had an excuse. "I'm not feeling great. Kate and I are going out of town. I'm busy with my parents." The walks we used to take became a thing of the past. By winter, the only time I saw George was during his increasingly frequent liquor store runs. I started driving by his house, worried about him. George and Kate had moved into one of the Oxford's many properties, a dilapidated Victorian mansion on the outskirts of town, miles away from their nearest neighbor. The house was old, with peeling white paint and green shutters that desperately needed repairing. Kate's shiny new Lexus looked out of place in the overgrown gravel driveway. But what struck me most was the crows. They were always there, dozens of them perched on the roof, scattered across the yard, or sitting silently in the trees surrounding the property. Their cawing would sometimes grow loud and insistent, but most of the time they just sat, watching, waiting. It was unsettling. Sometimes I would catch a glimpse of George through the window, a glass of wine in his hand, staring blankly at nothing. Despite the birds calling to him, despite me waving from my car, he never came outside. It was as if he was slowly fading away, swallowed by that decaying mansion and the life he now led. And the crows kept waiting, always waiting. As the damp and chilly spring continued, I knew I couldn't sit idly by any longer. When I saw George at the liquor store again, I rushed out of the restaurant to confront him. He looked awful. His pale skin had a sickly gray tint, and he had lost so much weight that his baggy sweatshirt seemed to swallow him. His eyes were hollow, and the scent of wine clung to his breath. He swayed slightly, barely aware of the crows, gathering around him like an ominous shadow. I couldn't help but bombard him with questions, asking, "Are you okay? Are you sick? Where have you been?" His responses were short and vague, almost as if he didn't fully understand what I was asking. But when I asked, "Why are you avoiding me?" his demeanor shifted. He went silent, turning his head away. "George?" I pressed gently, suddenly feeling like I'd crossed some invisible line. "I'm not allowed to have female friends," he said abruptly. "Not allowed?" I repeated, shocked. "Says who?" "Kate." His voice was a hollow whisper. "It's not your fault, Maria. You've been great. I've been a bad husband. And Kate wanted to set boundaries. I just need more time. She'll come around. This is all my fault." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Something was deeply wrong. This wasn't just about Kate being controlling. This felt like a ticking time bomb. "I have to go," he said quickly, glancing around nervously. "If she finds out I talked to you..." "Don't," I said urgently. George flinched at my tone, so I softened. "Please, George, we have to talk more. When can I see you again?" After a brief hesitation, he whispered, "The park. Tomorrow at 6 p.m., where no one can see us." "Deal," I said, trying to keep the desperation out of my voice. "Just be safe, George. Look after yourself, please." He didn't respond, just walked away with his wine, the crows trailing silently behind him like dark sentinels. The next evening, I waited on a bench in the far corner of the park, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky with fiery oranges that soon faded into deep blues. George arrived looking marginally better. At least he was steady on his feet this time. He wore oversized sunglasses, which seemed odd given the time of day, but I didn't question it right away. The crows had gathered again, watching us in their eerie, silent way. Lux, the white crow, fluttered down and nestled into George's arms. He stroked her feathers gently, his voice soft as he said, "She's doing so well now. The other crows just made her an elder. I'm so proud of her." I tried to ease into small talk, but it was like pulling teeth. George wasn't reading, wasn't drawing, wasn't doing anything that had once given him joy. He seemed lost. As the evening darkened, I finally asked why he was still wearing sunglasses. He hesitated, and then, almost apologetically, he said, "Please don't freak out." Slowly, he removed the sunglasses, revealing a massive bruise. It covered the left side of his face, a sickly purple blotch around his swollen, bloodshot eye. "Jesus Christ, George," I gasped. What happened to you?" He looked away, ashamed. "It's all my fault. One of Kate's friends saw us talking the other day, and Kate got upset. She didn't mean this. She promised it won't happen again." "Bullshit," I snapped. "Kate's got you locked in that mansion, George. She's controlling you. And now she's hurting you. You have to get out before she does something worse." A tear slipped down his bruised cheek, and he whispered, "I don't know what to do." I reached out and grabbed his hand, his skin cold to the touch. "You have to leave her. Get away as soon as you can." But George wasn't looking at me. His gaze had drifted to the crows, now numbering in the dozens, circling us like a dark, silent council. "I can't," he murmured. "She'll come after me. You don't know the Oxfords. They can find me anywhere. She'll kill me." I squeezed his hand tighter. "You have to try. I'll help you, George. We'll figure it out. But you have to make the first move." Desperately, I gestured to the crows. Ask them if they think you should leave Kate." For a long moment, George was silent, his head tilted slightly, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. The crows stared back with their cold, empty eyes unblinking and still. Lux croaked softly, her voice like a broken whisper. "They say I should leave," George finally said, his voice barely audible. "We devised a plan. It was simple, but it had to be. We'd wait until Kate was out of the house, and George would pack a few essentials and sneak out the back. I would park a few hundred feet down the road, far enough away to avoid being spotted by the maid who reported every car that passed to Kate. Once George was in the car, we'd drive, maybe Boston, maybe farther, anywhere but here. One evening, Kate went to dinner with her parents, leaving George behind. He told her he wasn't feeling well. That was our window. I parked my old sedan at our agreed-upon spot and sat on the hood, waiting for George to appear. The sky was overcast, the shadows growing darker as the night approached. It was still early spring, and the cold wind cut through my sweatshirt. A few crows perched on the roof of my car, their black eyes reflecting the fading light. They seemed to be waiting for George, too. My heart was racing. As I sat on the hood of my car, nerves twisting my stomach in knots, every rustle of the wind or movement in the shadows made me jump. The woods around me felt oppressive, their dark branches reaching like fingers toward the small, fragile space I occupied. I wasn't just scared of being caught by Kate or anyone else, I was terrified of the magnitude of what I was doing. Running off with George, leaving behind my grandparents, my job, my college, everything I had ever known. It seemed like madness. But George wasn't just some guy. He was the kindest person I had ever met, with a tenderness for things others found grotesque or scary. Where others might shy away from death, George embraced it with a fascination and reverence that had always set him apart. He loved the strange and the forgotten, the mushrooms sprouting in damp forests, and the bones left behind in the woods, and he could talk to crows. Thinking of the version of George though I had once known, sweet, curious, gentle, against the broken, bruised figure I now saw haunted me. How had I never seen the cage he was living in? How had I missed the bars that trapped him inside that mansion, suffocating him with abuse and isolation? I had to help him. I couldn't abandon him now. When George finally appeared, backpack slung over one shoulder, and a murder of crows following him like loyal guardians, his face was pale as death. The bruise from before was fading, but the yellow blotches only highlighted how fragile he looked. He was shaking. "Are you okay, George?" I asked, terrified. He admitted, "But okay."
I tried to smile to comfort him,
but my own fear gnawed at my insides. "So am I, let's go." We were just about to get in the car when the sound of screeching tires shattered the quiet. A sleek Lexus swerved into view, barely missing my car. The crows scattered, their frantic wings beating the air. I barely had time to process what was happening before Kate's shriek pierced the air. She was home early. For a moment, as Kate sat in her car screaming obscenities, I almost felt sorry for her. From her point of view, she had just found her husband about to flee with another woman, backpack in hand. To her, it must have seemed like the ultimate betrayal. But any sympathy I had evaporated when she threw her designer handbag at George, striking him squarely in the forehead. His frail body crumpled to the ground. In an instant, Kate was out of the car, launching herself at George. She pinned him down, raining blow after blow on his face and arms. Her voice was a furious mix of slurs and accusations, calling George a cheating bastard and me a Mexican whore. George's voice, weak and desperate, could barely be heard over Kate's rage. He sobbed, mumbling apologies, as if somehow he deserved this. I leapt toward her, trying to pull her off, but I was met with a sharp elbow to the face. Pain exploded through my nose, and I staggered backward, blood gushing from my crushed nose and down my throat, making me gag. Through the haze of pain, I could still hear Kate's screams, unrelenting, vicious, and violent. George's sobs were quieter now, fading into pitiful whimpers. Kate wasn't the composed heiress anymore. She was a wild animal, her face twisted into something unrecognizable, a snarling beast that was intent on destroying George. I knew, without a doubt, that if she didn't stop, she would kill him. I wanted to get up, to fight her off, but I was frozen. Blood poured from my nose, the metallic taste making me nauseous. My body pulsed with pain, and I felt utterly powerless. Then I saw them, the crows. Dozens, maybe hundreds. Their dark bodies forming a vortex in the sky above us. Their cawing grew louder, a deafening chorus that drowned out even Kate's screams. They spiraled closer and closer, a tornado of black feathers and sharp beaks. And at the center of it all, a flash of white. Lux. Lux landed on Kate's shoulder, and before Kate could react, the white crow began pecking at her face. Kate shrieked, trying to shake Lux off. But Lux only attacked more fiercely, her beak stabbing into Kate's skin. In seconds, other crows joined in, descending upon Kate in a violent frenzy. They tore at her hair, her hands, her face. Kate's screams turned from fury to pure terror. as the crows ripped at her flesh, pulling out chunks of skin and hair. "Help me, George!"
Hey.
Kate's voice was barely audible over the crow's cacophony, her words lost in the storm of wings and claws. The crows were relentless, their beaks shredding her body disappearing beneath the mass of black feathers. I turned to George, who had managed to stand, though he looked paralyzed, his face as pale as the bruise on his skin. His wide eyes reflected the swirling mass of crows, and I could see that this was beyond his control. The crows weren't listening to him. They were avenging him. "George!" I screamed, grabbing his hand. He didn't move, didn't blink.
"George, we have to go, now!"
At last, my words broke through, and he snapped out of his trance. We ran, leaving everything behind, including George's backpack. I shoved him into the car, and without looking back, I floored the gas pedal. The crow's deafening cries faded into the distance as we sped away, the tires squealing. As we tore down the road, we didn't stop until we were deep into town, far from the mansion, far from the crows, and far from Kate's blood-curdling screams. I pulled into an empty parking lot, and for a few moments, we sat in silence, panting, trying to catch our breath. Then we called 911. George and I never saw what was left of Kate after that night. We spent the following hours in the hospital, and the Oxfords arranged a closed casket funeral. All I knew came from overhearing my grandpa's conversation with a friend on the police force. Apparently, the police had only been able to identify Kate by her driver's license, found near her body in the road. The local paper labeled her death as a possible bear attack, but rumors spread quickly. Everyone knew the truth. It was George's crows. After George was discharged from the hospital, he stayed at my grandparents' house. We didn't sleep. Instead, we stayed up talking, the weight of everything still hanging over us. At around midnight, Lux appeared, tapping at the window. She had a gift. I should have been horrified seeing that white crow again, but I wasn't. I knew she wouldn't hurt me. None of them would. George opened the window, greeted Lux, and she hopped in, still stained with the reddish-brown remnants of blood. In her beak was a human finger, missing a nail but still adorned with a very familiar wedding ring. George smiled softly, thanked Lux, and tucked the finger into his pocket. There was something in his eyes that had changed. He looked lighter, almost relieved. It was as if the weight of Kate had finally lifted off him. Whether it was the finality of her death or the loyalty of the crows, I wasn't sure, but it didn't matter. I was just glad to have him back. I never asked George what he did with the finger. Despite how much I cared for him, there were some things I didn't need to know. That was over a year ago. Now George and I are both attending college in Boston. I live in an apartment near campus. While George commutes, the people in town still avoid him, though for different reasons now. They cross the street when they see him coming. Waiters rush to correct any mistakes with his order, and parents pull their children away if they wander too close. But I don't think they fear George himself. They fear the crows. The crows still follow him. Everywhere he goes, they're there, watching, guarding. Whenever I visit, they follow me too. Strangely, I've grown to appreciate their presence. I feel safer with them around. Sometimes, I ask George why he doesn't leave town. Why not move somewhere far away, where people don't know his name or the dark history that clings to him? But he always refuses. He won't leave the crows behind. It was the summer of 2002, a day that started out like any other, but quickly turned into one I would never forget. I was in my early 20s, just starting out in radio, working at Clear Channel Shreveport in Louisiana. I handled the overnight shifts on weekends, spinning records for 99X KTX-FM, a rock station. That particular day, our station was part of an annual event, held on Cross Lake, a big deal for us, as we had secured a sponsorship with a local boat dealership. They loaned us 2 boats for the day, a party barge and a smaller, motor-powered bass boat. It was the perfect day to be on the water. The sun was shining bright, and although it was windy, the waves added a certain energy to the lake. There were 6 of us aboard the party barge, soaking in the day, while a couple of others zipped around the lake in the bass boat. The wind, though playful, soon showed its true force, when it snatched the straw hat off one of the DJ's wives, flinging it into the water. Without hesitation, I sprang into action. I ripped off my shirt, kicked off my shoes, and dove in after the hat. What I didn't consider in my haste was the lack of a life jacket. Swimming to the hat was easy enough, but as I turned back, I quickly realized I was in trouble. The wind and waves weren't going to let me get back to the boat. At first, my co-workers thought I was joking, laughing as I waved my arms for help. But soon, they realized I wasn't kidding. I was in serious danger. Panic began to settle in as I realized I was being pulled further from the barge, my strength draining with each passing moment. The program director, someone who would later become one of my closest friends, tossed a life preserver in my direction, but the wind swept it out of my reach. Desperation clawed at me as the boat attempted to get closer, but it wasn't built for quick moves, and the driver wasn't exactly an expert. All I could do was keep kicking, struggling to keep my head above the churning water. The director managed to get the base boat's attention, but they were on the other side of the lake. I was on my own, fighting to survive until they arrived. Every second felt like a lifetime, and for the first time, the very real possibility of death settled in my mind. Just when I was about to give up, the base boat arrived, skimming across the water and pulling me aboard just in time. I collapsed onto the deck, breathless and shaking, but alive. The one person I had tried to help by rescuing a hat, no less, was the one whose husband had saved me from drowning that day. Since then, I've never stepped foot near water without a life jacket. Some lessons you learn the hard way, and that day I learned mine. I used to work on the north slope of Alaska, in the oil industry. The work we were doing required us to travel far out into the Alaska Petroleum Reserve, which is basically just untamed tundra wilderness for hundreds of miles. The oil companies would build these long ice roads in the winter that would lead to exploration drilling pads. Our job was to go out after they finished the initial drilling and test rock formations for their oil-producing qualities. It was mid-January, the sun hadn't quite come up yet. And when I say the sun hadn't come up, I mean in almost a month and a half. Polar nights are intense. The particular well site we were traveling to was about 60 miles west of Alpine, Alaska, deep in the wilderness. Our job took a week, but we finished and were headed back to camp to finish our hitch and go home. At the beginning and end of the ice roads are guard shacks that you have to check in and out of for safety, no cell reception, and radios work only up to a distance. If you don't check in or out in a set time they come looking for you to ensure you're not a popsicle. It was about 4 a.m, not that it mattered in the land of endless night, and we were halfway across the ice road. Travel was slow as the speed limit on the roads is only 25 mph. When something appeared on the road in our headlights, it was a man in jeans, sneakers, and a hoodie jacket, walking down an ice road in wilderness tundra. At 4 a.m. and it was 20 degrees outside, it's not unusual for the local Inuit people to be out this far hunting. Maybe his snowmobile broke down, and he's trying to get back to the guard shack? Seemed plausible. He didn't acknowledge us as our trucks rolled up next to him. He just kept shuffling forward. He didn't seem cold. His clothing, while totally not appropriate for this extreme weather, appeared warm and dry. We also noticed he wasn't Inuit, but Caucasian. I rolled down my window and asked if he needed any help and if he was okay. He still didn't acknowledge us, just kept shuffling forward. His face was completely blank, devoid of any thought or emotions. The other guys in my truck suggested that maybe he was in an accident and in shock. I continued rolling my truck alongside him as he trudged down the road, still trying to get his attention. Even in this extreme cold, I could occasionally get whiffs of a peculiar smell coming off him. He smelled acidic, if that makes sense. There was just a lot about this guy that made the hair on my neck stand up. The guy behind me in the truck's crew cab had had enough of all this. He rolled down his window and reached out to grab the guy. He later said he was just going to try and shake him out of his stupor. Before my buddy's hand could reach him, though, this walking popsicle spun around and latched on to my buddy's outstretched arm. He glared at my buddy and then at me with this look of pure rage, not removing his hand from his arm. If emotions had a physical temperature, this guy could have melted the entire tundra. That night, my buddy groaned in pain as he tried to get his arm free from Mr. Popsicle. And at that moment, this guy starts screaming in our faces. There was so much hate and rage and anger in that scream. It was absolutely terrifying. I slammed on the gas and spun out on the ice for a second before the wheels caught and launched us forward. Popsicle dude still had a hold of my buddy's arm and was trying to pull him out of the truck. He was running alongside the truck while the other guys in the cab held on to my buddy to keep him inside. After several moments, it could only have been a few seconds at most, my buddy tore free from this guy, and we hauled ass to the guard shack another 30 miles down the road. We checked in with the guards and reported what we had just seen. The guard was looking at us like we were pulling a prank, but policy said they had to check it out. Regardless, my buddy's arm was sore, and when he pulled back his sleeve there were noticeable bruises in the shape of a hand around his arm. We filed a report with the guard and were told to head back to our camp. None of us really wanted to talk about what happened, and it was a quiet drive the rest of the way. We flew home the next day. The next time we saw the guard at this shack, we asked him if they ever saw Mr. Popcycle on his patrols. He told us they searched up and down that ice road for a solid 12-hour shift and saw nothing, not even tracks in the snow leading off the road. He told us it was a good prank, and that he'd get us back for making him waste a shift driving around, but it wasn't a prank. Who would make up a story like that? And who would willingly bruise their arm? For a dumb prank? We never got a satisfying answer to what happened that evening. I still wonder about that dude, if he even was a dude. The Alaskan tundra is a weird place, and that was just one of my many weird stories from my time up there. I'll work to write down more of my experiences and share them to the appropriate subs